just following up on this business of interpreting and personal qualities and capabilities of the interpreters, which I have been talking about here, we have Kaiser, for example, in 1978, with reference to conference interpreting, emphasizes that there is an element of knowledge you need to have, which is to master both languages very well, and you have general knowledge and background knowledge about the topic that you're in, and also personal qualities, including the ability to intuit, meaning you have to be intuitive in your getting the meaning as quickly as possible, and adaptability, concentration, memory skills, and of course public speaking is just as important. And finally, pleasant voice. Well, pleasant voice is not as important, really. This is not as important as the other elements that are mentioned here with regards to your memory. And of course, we talk about short memory. If you are doing, however, consecutive, then more you rely on your memory more, and you rely more on your note-taking when you are writing note-taking while being interpreting there as well. In liaison interpreting, language skills are just as important. Cultural competence is very important. Technical and interpreting techniques, as well as memory skills. And there is also the element of professional ethics. This is another element of professional ethics, which you need to be also aware of and pay attention to that. In sign language, however, there is the interpersonal, cross-cultural skills which you need to be competent in, as well as interpreting skills which are under language skills. That is for sign interpreters. Now we have finished as part of this series of these two elements, which is content, course content and training, which is the first video I have actually done, and also competence and personal qualities of the interpreters. And finally, working conditions, stress, and health issues. Now, in this one here, working conditions, this is really very important because sometimes there are some industrial issues relating to the employment conditions, and here we are talking about level of compensation. We're talking also about treatment by the employers, and we're talking about excessive or amount of work, both in the sense of excessive workload and underemployment. And here, of course, we are talking about, when we talk about the level of compensation, let's say, for example, that for some reason you are booked for to do an interpreting session, and at the last minute they've cancelled. Usually you should not cancel. There is a certain limit before you can cancel a job. Otherwise, you have to pay for that job, even though it's not done. That's in consecutive interpreting. Also, I mean, this is compensation. Also, there's another type of compensation which is relating to health issues. For example, let's say, for God forbid, somebody got infected because of interpreting in hospital, or hurt by the client. In a situation where they are threatened and physically attacked, what kind of compensation, psychological effect, it affects the psychology of the interpreter, who has nothing to do with it. And also there are some situations where the interpreters, like in war zones, they were killed. What about the compensation to their families? Because they lost their loved ones here, the interpreter who has been in crossfire, for example. Also the treatment by the employers, for example, how much percentage the employer should take of the pay, 40%, 30%, and so on. And should it be from the service provider who is actually booking you, not the actual employer who has actually sent you to do the job of interpreting. That is if you're doing freelance. And most of the interpreters do freelance interpreting, and that is why it is quite essential that you have this to see what kind of treatment you're getting there. And also, when you are actually being asked to interpret in the booth into both languages, like from Arabic to English, from English to Arabic. This is really unfair, because you've got a switch in your head, like a light switch, where you can move from one language to another. You cannot do that in simultaneous interpreting, in a conference interpreting. And employers need to be aware of that. And these are the part of the ethics of interpreting. You should not actually be doing into two languages when you are doing simultaneous interpreting for conferences. And that's because of the operation of, language switching operation in your mind, in your head. Because sometimes you forget that you should be switching from language A to language B, or language B to language A, L1 to L2 and L2 to L1, back and forth. That's really problematic, because sometimes you get confused which language you should be outputting in because of the fact that you're doing that. Now, of course, you can do that if it's just a question being asked to the client and they are answering, or they are in the conference. That is fine to do both ways, but not in a conference, in a proper conference. In a press release or press conference, it's fine, because it's only questions and answers. That's fine. And also, there's a very important element I've just remembered about conference interpreting, is that the actual text itself is preset, pre-prepared by the speaker, and therefore it is more challenging for the interpreter, because it's more compact, there's more density of information, it's the information is very dense, and also the actual text, the syntax, is more complex, because it's well prepared. Speech compared to ad-lib or improvised speech, where it is ad-libbed. And in ad-libbed, you will have more redundancy in the way people speak, because it's not as compact, as condensed. So therefore, it's more challenging for interpreters when somebody is reading from a paper, when they are doing their speech. And that is more challenging, because there's more pressure on the chunking meaning how many words you should be actually breaking your what you are receiving. So every 9 words you speak, every 9 words. These are called units, meaningful units, where you are splitting the strategy, piecemeal strategy, which is what's called salami technique, where you are actually breaking the speech into section or into chunks. It is noticed in one of these by one of the scholars that those who are reading pre-prepared speeches, they tend to read a lot of before they pause. Before they pause, they read a lot of text before they pause. Sometimes 23 words in one go. So it's a bit very challenging, and more pressure on time constraint in terms of speed, in terms of speaking or speech and pausing, because there are 2 pauses, of course: syntactic pause, which you need to be aware of, semantic pause as well. But it is noticeable as well that when you are prepared in the ad-lib one, in the improvised speech, it is much easier because it's less condensed. And some speakers, they tend to be a little bit more, a little bit kind or kinder than to the interpreter, by slowing down a little bit when they are speaking, because they are aware somebody else is actually listening to their ideas and trying to produce them. And this is yet another. The amount of excessive work, just going back to the same point that was made about amount of work, both in the sense of excessive workload. Excessive workload, for example, in the booth, you are left for 1 hour interpreting, up to 1 hour, which is extremely very hard for the interpreter who's doing simultaneous to stay for a whole hour actually interpreting, because you are actually producing or outputting the ideas and the concepts of somebody else, of the speaker's views. And this is, and also the underemployment, when they are actually employing just one interpreter to do both, from Arabic to English and English into Arabic in simultaneous interpreting. I want to point out something else which is relating to sometimes, the press office of the speaker or the organization or the organizers of the conference. They might give you the speeches beforehand. Now, that is really good to have, but of course, what do you do with these speeches? You don't go and translate them because there's no point. You don't have time to go and sit down and read them. I mean, some people might assume that you have to go and translate the whole thing and then go into the booth and do it. No, you can't do that. What you do is what you learn from this is that you look at only the ideas. You just understand the ideas. That's one thing. And also, if there is a term that you are not familiar with and you would like to see what's their equivalent in the other language, in the target language, that's what you do. That's what you prepare yourself to do. Now, in terms of the interpreter's working environment, for example, the physical environment, you need to be aware that, for example, in the booth, you have to be very quiet. You cannot stand in the middle of nowhere with a lot of noise and do that. Also, you need to have headphones in order to hear what the speaker is saying from a distance. You need to see the speaker when you are interpreting so that you can actually follow up with them. Also, you need to prepare yourself well for the task. This is very important. If you cannot just turn up straight away to a conference all of a sudden without being given any, few days to prepare yourself, to read about the conference, to read background information about the conference. And also you need to, this is yet another thing about the assignment when you are actually interpreting. I'm just going to show you this, the physical environment of time and place is very, very important. They give you more time to actually prepare yourself, and the place is very quiet. You have a booth. You are nobody's disturbing you. Also, you have to, when the task-related factors are important preparation, you have to prepare yourself well. You read in English, you read in Arabic, all articles, you watch TV, you read about the conference as much as possible if it's a conference. Cognitive workload, of course, how much chunking, how much information you read to receive before you output, and the the variables of the input. How many words before you start speaking, because you need to really start speaking very quickly, but then you need to listen and understand what you're listening to before you do that. There are also, if you're doing interpreting, interpersonal factors, especially if you're talking about relationship with your team members. For example, your interpreter next to you who's sitting in the booth, you need to have coordinating with them. Also, when you find that the speaker is very fast, you need to press the button and tell the speaker to help your friend who's listening and finding the speed of the speaker is too high. The ratio is very, very high. You need to ask the speaker to slow down. And you just press the button and say slow. And also the client feedback. This is extremely important to know what the clients, what the people, the audience think of the interpreter. What's their, you can do a survey for the audience who are listening to that one. With regards to working conditions, of course, for the conference interpreting, of course, you need to have the actual booth size needs to be comfortable, and the quality of the sound is good. And also, you need to check the equipment that it's working. Now, that's what John Pelt has said describe the working environment of conference interpreters under international standards, ISO 2603, which is first adopted in 1974 for what is called built-in booths, and they are permanent. Sometimes you can move them around the booths. Sometimes they bring them for the conference, and sometimes you move them around there. So that is really something that's very important. I'll move on very quickly to stress and health. And there is the AIIC workload study, which addresses physiological, and psychological parameters in the professional practice of conference interpreting. Of course, what's AIIC it's not as if I care, abbreviation for as if I care. No, of course not. It is actually the association, the International Interpreters Conference Association. This is what it is. And of course, there is also the element, not physical and physiological and psychological. Now, physical, of course, that you are to have physiological, that you are able to do the job in hand. Physical, you should have what you can really do in 20-minute piece of interpreting up to half an hour maximum. Physiologically, you have to be capable of doing that task, and you need to be not over-exhausted. As psychological parameters, the cognitive element there, and your information processing. And there is the fatigue, which is resulting from excessive taking turns in simultaneous interpreting up to 60 minutes. It has a very detrimental effect on the performance, according to various, like Moser and Mercer et al. In 1998 and Zier in 1997. So this is really very, very stressful and very, very tiring, exhausting to do it for 60 minutes in the booth. Of course, there are other occupational hazards for interpreters in the community, which include risk of infection in medical settings, like in hospitals, and threats to personal safety, as in the case of police settings in the prison. For example, if you're interpreting for a young man with an officer, or in the legal cases, and that you are actually doing that. I have actually covered all these various elements, which for today are this. And here are a few shots of me in one of the booths when I was interpreting, which I would like to share with you. Thank you.